Okay, this recording is going to cover how we build SQL tables inside of Visual Studio and how we can make two tables link to each other using common fields that link primary keys to foreign keys. We've talked about this concept before, so I think I'm going to start with that. If you have two tables, let's take, for example, athletes and sports. If I have an athletes table and a sports table, I might have an athlete uh, linked to a particular sport. Um, in reality, I would probably do this with a third table so that I could have athletes playing multiple sports. But just for this simple example, we'll start with this. If I were to build the athletes table, I might create an ID field, and this might be of type integer, and this is going to be an identity. And if you remember, identity means that this field will automatically increment. And so this would be my primary key. In other words, every single athlete is going to have an athlete ID number that is unique. Since it's an identity field, and I'll show you how to set that up, it will automatically increment as I add athletes. The athletes might also have a first name and a last name. Um, and then over here on the sports table, I need a primary key for the sports table, which I will also call ID, and it's going to be of type um, int, and it will also be an identity, meaning it will automatically increment. Now you'll notice that I chose to make um, this field name, whoops, that's supposed to be a highlighter, and this field name the same. That's two different tables. It doesn't matter if I use the exact same name, because remember that this ID is related to the sports table, and this ID over here is related to the athletes table, which means when I use a query, I'm going to be using things like sports.id or athletes.id. The fact that the two things are named exactly the same is not what allows you to link them together. It's a join or a database diagram with constraints that's going to actually link the two things together. So let's go on here, and I will go back and talk about um, uh, the rest of this sports ID. So the sports table is going to also have maybe a field called name, which is the name of the sport. This will probably be a varchar. I'll make it varchar 50. Um, okay, so right now I have nothing that could link these together. So if I have an athlete in the athlete table, what's going to say which sport it is? So what I would do is I would put a field that's going to act as a foreign key. So I might call it sport ID over in this table. And this is going to link via a foreign key to this primary key. In other words, there could be one sport with many athletes attached to it, a one-to-many type relationship. Um, and that would be done either with a database diagram that will impose constraints on the system, or it can just be done in your own SQL code as you update and remove and delete. So that's what we're going to try to build. We're going to try to build a two-table system, and I'd like you to try and do it in Visual Studio. So I'm going to hop over to Visual Studio, and the first thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to see the SQL um, uh, database explorer here. So I'm going to go to View, and I will pick SQL Server Object Explorer, and that will add over here on the left-hand side, that will add this tab into I have the toolbox, I have the SQL Server Explorer, and you should see local DB with some stuff after it. That means that's the SQL Server that's running local on your computer, and that's where we're going to actually build these sample databases. So if you go ahead and expand that out, you should see databases. And if you expand that out, you should see any databases that have already been created. So we're going to create our first database by right-clicking and say Add New Database. It's going to ask you for a name, so I'll call this the sample sports database. Sample sports appears in my list on the left. Expand that out, and I should have tables. I don't have any tables yet. Well, I have some system tables, but I don't have any user tables. So I'm going to right click, and I'm going to say add new table. And I get this type of design interface. This allows me to create the fields. So here it preloaded a field called ID, and it told it was an int. It's been designated as the primary key, but I'd like that to automatically increment for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight that field by clicking on it. And then over here on the right-hand side in my properties, I can turn on identity specification. Identity specification will make this auto increment. So if I set that to true, now every time that I create a new entry in the table, it'll automatically add an ID number, one larger than the previous. If I wanted it to start with a number like 7,000 or 10,000 or something, I could make that identity seed something other than 1. I'm just going to leave it at 1. I don't care if the first athlete is ID number 1. Now I'm going to put in my other fields. So I want an athlete to have a first name, and I tend to use varchar for my fields. They work very nicely with .NET, C#, easy to move back and forth between strings and varchars. And the number inside parentheses is how long you want the string to be. So if it's 50, that means I can put 50 characters in there. That seems a little long for a first name, so I might drop that down to 30 for somebody who might have a complicated first name, especially if you're talking about making this a application that works in other locations. You may get complicated foreign names that are different than American names. So remember to keep that in mind when you're designing the sizes of your database objects. So I'll go ahead and put in a last name and varchar. I'll make that 50. And then let's go with sport ID. And I'm going to make that an int. And so here I have my basic table structure similar to what I had over here. Primary key, first name, last name, and sport ID. So now I need to actually save this table. So down here in the create table script code, right here under create table dbo.table, this word table here is the name of the table. So I don't want to call it table, I want to call it athletes. So now if I execute this query, it will save this table in my database. So up here at the top left of the screen is the update button. So if I hit that, it'll get ready to run this SQL against the SQL server. So I'm going to go ahead and update the database. It should run. Down at the bottom, you see what it's doing. I got a green check mark that it created the update. And so if I go back to my SQL Server Object Explorer, I can see that I now have the athletes table. I can now add some stuff to the athletes table by right-clicking on it and say View Data. So here in Visual Studio, I can actually enter some information. So I might put in athlete John Doe, and sport ID, I'm going to leave null for now. If I hit these little red exclamation points, means that this data is being written, like I'm editing, but it hasn't been written to the database yet. So if I hit enter somewhere on that line, it'll actually commit that data to the database. The ID increments, you can see it put it in as 1. I can now put in a new athlete, Jane Doe, and hit enter, and it increments to 2. Okay, so the athletes table is designed. I can close those. I can always get them back again by right-clicking and picking either View Data or View Designer. View Designer is that database designer that allows me to change properties of the table. So I'm going to create another new one. Let's go ahead and create the other table. So, oops, right-click on the right thing, add new table. So I'm going to leave that as ID. I'm going to set its property over here on the right-hand side to identity. True. Okay, the sport has a name. Varchar 50, that's fine. In my very simple data table example here, this is all I need. So I'm going to go ahead and change this table name down here to sports. Oops. And then I'm going to update. Now I'm going to go back to my Explorer. There's my sports table. I can view the data. And I'm going to give this one ping pong. And we'll call it, I don't know, volleyball. Volleyball. Okay, so here, sport ID 1 or sports.id with a value of 1 now just simply means ping pong. Sports ID with value 2 now means volleyball. So what I can use is I can use that field in my athletes table to represent what sport somebody plays. So John Doe, say for example, he plays volleyball. So his sport ID should be 2. That links him between the two tables. Now, I haven't created database diagrams. I'll show that at some future time, how you can enforce parent-child, one-to-many, many-to-many type constraints, which means that like if I delete one thing, some other things can cascade the delete. But we're not going to talk about that right now. Just need to know that if you want to do a relational database type design where one table is related to another table, child fields are related to parent fields, you need a field in one table that is linked to the primary key in another table. So in our case, sport ID is representing the ID field in the other table, and so it would be volleyball in this case. Now I could have a whole bunch of information about this particular sport. I could have its fees, I could have its maximum number of registrants, I could have all sorts of things that because this person is linked, I could now look up and figure out what's the total fees owed by John Doe for his sport. And like I said at the very beginning, I wouldn't actually build this relationship this way. I would actually build a third table which links athletes to sports because one athlete might play multiple sports. But in this particular example, to keep it simple, I just wanted to do this two-tier linking. Okay, so in Visual Studio, you can use Visual Studio's SQL Object Explorer to build databases and save them and update their data. So please try and do that. Build a two-table database. Pick a field which you will use from the second table and represent it as a field in the first table. Just because both tables have an ID field does not mean that they're linked together. So here, for example, John Doe with ID 1 in the first table is not related to ping pong with ID 1 in the second table. It's when you link a second field like sport ID is now going to be representing the primary key of a second table when you begin to build this relational ideas.